The ship looked like a floating city beneath the afternoon sun, white decks, polished windows, and balconies glittering above the harbor. Daniel Mercer stood beside the terminal doors, with one hand resting on his suitcase and the other around Elena's waist. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe the trip could change everything. They had been married for 9 years. 9 years was long enough to memorize someone's habits, Daniel thought, but apparently not long enough to notice when those habits began changing. Elena smiled as they approached the gangway. It was the same smile she had used in photographs for years, pleasant and controlled. Daniel knew better. Recently, her smiles had started arriving a second too late. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm tired. We haven't even left yet." She laughed softly. "Then maybe I'm tired of airports." Daniel smiled because he wanted the conversation to remain harmless. The cruise had been his idea. He had booked the balcony cabin, chosen the itinerary, and told Elena that 7 days at sea might give them the distance they needed from work, bills, family, and the arguments that seemed to appear from nowhere. He did not tell her why. He was afraid that if they returned home unchanged, their marriage might not survive another year. Inside, everything seemed designed to suggest happiness. Music drifted through the atrium. Couples carried champagne toward the elevators. Children ran between fountains and glass railings. Crew members welcomed passengers with practiced warmth. Elena seemed distracted by her phone. She checked it while they waited for their cabin cards. Then again in the elevator. Then once more after they entered their room. Daniel noticed. "Who keeps texting you?" "Nobody." He looked at her. She slipped the phone into her handbag. "Just work. You said you weren't checking work during this trip." "I know." Her answer came quickly. Too quickly. Daniel said nothing. Over the next several hours, small things accumulated. Elena disappeared after lunch for nearly 40 minutes and returned with no explanation. Later, while they explored the upper deck, she suddenly slowed when 2 uniformed officers passed them. Her expression changed. It lasted only a moment, but Daniel saw it. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing. You look nervous." "I didn't." Daniel watched the officers disappear down the corridor. That evening, they ate dinner beneath warm lights while the ocean stretched black beyond the windows. Elena barely touched her food. Twice, she glanced toward the entrance. Then her phone vibrated. She stood immediately. "I'll be back." "Where are you going?" "I need some air." Daniel watched her leave. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. He finally stood. He found her near a restricted corridor overlooking the stern, speaking quietly with a man in a white naval uniform. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized the authority in the man's posture. The captain. Elena turned and saw Daniel. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then the captain stepped away. Elena hurried toward her husband, but Daniel's attention remained fixed on the man behind her. He did not know what they had been discussing. He only knew Elena had lied about where she was going. And for the first time since they boarded the ship, Daniel understood that the problem in their marriage might not be something the ocean could wash away. The look on Elena's face when Daniel found her, with the captain, stayed with him long after they returned to their cabin. She had looked frightened. Not guilty. Not exactly. Frightened. Daniel replayed the moment while Elena stood at the balcony doors, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. The ship moved steadily through the night, its engines humming beneath their feet. "Who was he?" Daniel asked. "The captain." "I know that." Elena turned. "Then why ask?" Daniel almost laughed. Once, they could have teased each other like this. Now every sentence seemed to carry something underneath it. "What did he want?" "Nothing." "Then why were you talking to him alone?" "I needed to ask him something." "What?" Elena hesitated. About the itinerary. Daniel watched her. She looked away first. That small movement reminded him of another time, years earlier, when they had stood in their kitchen after Daniel had accused her of hiding messages from a coworker. She had denied it then too. Eventually, the argument had ended with Elena crying and Daniel insisting that he only asked questions because he cared. At the time, he believed that. Perhaps Elena had stopped believing it long before he realized. She had spent years adapting herself to Daniel's expectations. At first, his questions had seemed like concern. Where are you going? Who called? Why are you late? When will you be home? Later, the questions became accusations. Then they became rules. Elena learned to avoid arguments by withholding information. Daniel interpreted the silence as proof that something was wrong. Neither of them understood that they were feeding the same wound. That night, Elena waited until Daniel was asleep before stepping into the corridor. She told herself she only needed a few minutes. At the end of the hallway, Adrian Vale was waiting. He was not supposed to be there, and neither was she. "You shouldn't have come," Adrian said quietly. "I know. You're making this harder." Elena looked toward the elevators. "I just needed to see you." Adrian studied her face. "You need to decide what you're going to do." "I know." "No, Elena. You need to decide before somebody gets hurt." She lowered her eyes. For months, Adrian had been the one person who listened without demanding an explanation. He never told her what she should wear, who she should speak to, or why she had taken too long to answer a message. That difference had frightened her as much as it attracted her. Because with Adrian, Elena had begun imagining a life outside the marriage. A life Daniel could not control. But imagining it was easier than choosing it. When she returned to the cabin, Daniel was awake. "You were gone again," he said. Elena froze. "I couldn't sleep. You said you were going to get some air." "I changed my mind." Daniel nodded slowly. He did not argue. That surprised her. He simply turned away and closed his eyes. But Daniel was not asleep. For the first time, he understood that confronting Elena might make her better at hiding the truth. So he decided to wait. The next morning, he began watching. He noticed when Elena checked her phone. He noticed which corridors she preferred. He noticed how often Adrian appeared nearby. And each observation gave him another piece of a story he was not yet ready to believe. By breakfast, Daniel had stopped asking questions. Instead, he started collecting answers. What Daniel did not know was that the next clue would come from Elena herself, when one careless lie finally gave him a reason to follow her. The next morning, Daniel watched Adrian Vale command the ship without ever raising his voice. A crew member approached with a question, and Adrian answered immediately. Another officer handed him a document. He scanned it, signed it, and continued walking. Passengers greeted him as though they knew him personally. Elena watched him too. Daniel noticed. That was enough to make the breakfast table feel colder. Adrian was not young enough to seem reckless, nor careless enough to appear unaware of the risks around him. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years being obeyed. Yet when Elena spoke to him, something changed. His expression softened. He listened. Daniel remembered when he used to listen that way. Or perhaps he only remembered wanting to. Later that morning, Elena found Adrian near the observation deck. "You shouldn't keep doing this," Adrian said. "I know. You're married. I know that too. And I'm responsible for everyone on this ship." Elena looked at him. "Then why do you keep talking to me?" Adrian had no immediate answer. That silence told her more than an answer could have. Neither of them noticed Daniel standing several decks below. He had followed Elena after seeing her leave their cabin. Now he watched them from a distance. He could not hear the conversation, but he could see enough. The familiarity. The hesitation. The way Elena looked at Adrian when she believed nobody was watching. Daniel walked away before either of them saw him. He spent the next hour alone. By afternoon, he had convinced himself that there might still be an explanation. By evening, he no longer believed it. When Elena entered their cabin, Daniel was sitting beside the window. "Where were you?" "Walking." "With Adrian?" She stopped. The silence answered before she did. "Daniel, don't." "Don't what?" "Start this." "Start what?" "Asking you where you've been. You know exactly what you're doing." Daniel stood. "I saw you." Elena's face hardened. "You followed me?" "I wanted the truth." "No." "You wanted evidence." The word struck him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel said, "Is there something between you and him?" Elena looked toward the balcony. "Answer me. I don't owe you an answer every time you become suspicious." Daniel laughed bitterly. "After 9 years, I don't even recognize you. Maybe that's because you never tried to." He stared at her. Elena's voice trembled, but she continued. "You wanted a wife who never questioned you. Someone who stayed home when you wanted her home. Someone who explained every minute of her day. Every friend became a problem. Every disagreement became disrespect. I was trying to protect our marriage. You were controlling it." Daniel looked away. Elena wiped her eyes. "Our marriage was dying long before we boarded this ship." The room became silent. Those words changed something. Daniel had expected denial, perhaps anger, but not surrender. Elena walked toward the door. Daniel did not stop her. But as she disappeared into the corridor, he noticed something on the table. Her phone was missing. And for the first time, Daniel understood that whatever existed between Elena and Adrian was not a passing mistake. It was a secret with a history. And Daniel was finally close enough to uncover it. He remained by the window, listening to the faint vibration of the engines. Somewhere beyond the walls, Elena was moving through the ship, carrying a life he had not been invited to see. Daniel felt something colder than jealousy settling inside him. It was certainty, and certainty made patience feel easier than rage. For the moment, Daniel had spent the afternoon pretending he was not looking for Elena. He told himself he was giving her space. He ordered coffee, walked through the observation lounge, and watched the ocean until the endless horizon became almost hypnotic. But beneath the calm, one thought kept returning. Where was she? By early evening he knew. He had seen her leave the cabin carrying nothing but her phone. 20 minutes later, Daniel followed. He moved carefully, keeping enough distance that she would not notice him. Elena crossed 2 decks, passed a quiet corridor near the officers' quarters, and disappeared through a door marked for authorized personnel. Daniel stopped. He stared at the door. For several seconds, he considered turning around. Instead, he waited. Then the door opened slightly. Daniel stepped closer. Through the narrow gap, he saw Elena. Adrian was with her. They were standing close, speaking in voices too low to hear. Adrian reached for her hand. Elena did not pull away. That was enough. Daniel saw the way she looked at him. It was not the expression of a woman speaking to a captain about an itinerary. It was tenderness. Recognition. Something private. Something Daniel had not seen in her eyes for years. He stepped backward. The door closed. For a moment, Daniel felt nothing. Then everything arrived at once. The arguments. The unanswered messages. The sudden trips outside. The nervous glances. The lies. Every memory seemed to rearrange itself. He had spent days searching for an explanation because he was afraid of the truth. Now the truth was standing inside him like a blade. He could have opened the door. He could have shouted. He could have demanded that Adrian explain himself. Instead, Daniel walked away. His hands were shaking as he reached the elevator. A crew member smiled and asked if he needed assistance. Daniel smiled back. "No, I'm fine." The lie came easily. He went to the bar. One drink became two. Then another. The music around him grew louder as his thoughts became darker. Couples laughed nearby. Glasses touched. Someone celebrated an anniversary. Daniel watched them with an expression that even he could not understand. He remembered his own anniversary with Elena. He remembered the restaurant, the flowers, the promise that they would always tell each other the truth. He remembered believing her. He ordered another drink. By midnight, Daniel was walking without knowing where he was going. He passed the casino, then the theater, then the empty corridors where the lights seemed dimmer than before. The ship continued moving through the darkness, indifferent to what had happened inside it. Daniel stopped beside a window. The ocean was invisible except for occasional flashes of white foam. He pressed his forehead against the glass. He thought about killing the marriage. He thought about leaving. He thought about confronting Elena. Then another thought appeared. What if she left him? What if she chose Adrian? What if everyone eventually learned that Daniel Mercer had been the husband who could not keep his wife? His breathing became shallow. He closed his eyes. Somewhere behind him, footsteps approached. Daniel turned. It was Elena. She stopped when she saw him. Neither spoke. Her face told him she knew. And suddenly, the next conversation between them no longer felt like a question of whether Elena had betrayed him. It was a question of what Daniel would do now that he knew. For several seconds, Daniel heard only the engines. Elena took one cautious step toward him. "Daniel." He raised a hand. She stopped. He wanted to ask how long it had been, when it started, and whether she had ever loved him. But the questions felt useless. He looked toward the dark corridor. "Go back to the cabin," he said quietly. She stared at him. "Daniel, please. Just go." She hesitated, then walked away. Daniel remained alone. The restraint frightened him deeply. The question remained between them after Elena stopped speaking. "After the cruise," she said again. "I'm leaving." Daniel stared at her, as though the words belonged to someone else. Outside, the neighborhood had gone quiet. Inside, the clock on the kitchen wall seemed impossibly loud. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Because of him?" Elena looked away. "Not only because of him." Daniel laughed once, but there was nothing amused in it. "So you've been playing this?" "I've been thinking about leaving for a long time." "And you never told me." "I tried." "No." "You complained. You threatened. You made me feel guilty." "That isn't trying to leave." Elena's voice tightened. "Daniel, I was afraid of what would happen if I told you I was done." The sentence changed his expression. "Afraid of me?" She did not answer immediately. That silence hurt him more than an accusation could have. "I loved you," Daniel said. "Do you understand that? Everything I did was because I loved you. Love isn't supposed to feel like permission to control someone." His jaw tightened. "I never hit you. I didn't say you did. But you're making me sound dangerous. I'm telling you how I felt." Daniel stepped closer. Elena instinctively moved back. He noticed. For several seconds neither spoke. Then his anger disappeared, replaced by something almost childlike. "Please don't do this," he whispered. Elena closed her eyes. "I can't stay. I can change. You said that before. I mean it now. You mean it because you're losing me." Daniel looked toward the floor. "I can forgive the affair," he said. Elena opened her eyes. "You don't get to forgive me for leaving." His face hardened again. "So you're choosing him." "I'm choosing myself." Daniel shook his head. After everything I gave you? That's exactly the problem. You keep talking about marriage like I owe you a debt. I gave you a home. And I gave you my life. The words landed heavily. Elena reached for her coat. Daniel watched her pick it up. Where are you going? Home. This is your home. Not anymore. She moved toward the door. Daniel stepped between her and it. Elena stopped. Move. I just want one final conversation. We've had enough conversations. One final one, he repeated. His voice was calm now, almost too calm. Elena looked at the door, then at him. For the first time that night, she understood that the argument was no longer about the affair, the cruise, or the other man. It was about whether Daniel could accept a decision he had not made himself. And standing there, blocking the only exit, he was showing her exactly how little control she had over what happened next. Daniel, step aside. I said one conversation. You're frightening me. His eyes flickered. I would never hurt you. Then let me walk out. He did not move. That was the answer. Elena lowered her coat. Daniel noticed and seemed relieved, mistaking surrender for understanding. Thank you, he said. She looked at him with a sadness that made his expression collapse. This is why I'm leaving. He swallowed. I thought if I could make you understand, you'd stay. I understand you perfectly. No, you don't. I do. Silence filled the room again. Daniel began pacing, speaking faster, as though words could rebuild the marriage. He blamed the affair, the cruise, Elena's friends, then himself. He apologized for being jealous, accused her of making him jealous, apologized again, and demanded to know whether she had ever loved him. Elena answered quietly, yes. Once. The answer seemed to break something inside him. Once? Yes. Daniel stopped pacing. Then when did it end? Elena hesitated. A long time ago. He turned away. His shoulders trembled. When he looked back, there were no tears. Go upstairs, he said. Elena stared at him. What? Just go upstairs. We'll talk tomorrow. She knew better than to believe him. Yet the exhaustion in his voice made her hesitate. She picked up her coat again. Daniel watched her. Neither understood that this hesitation would matter. Because by morning, the question would no longer be whether Elena intended to leave. It would be whether she would ever get the chance. By morning, Elena would no longer be asking whether she could leave. But the night was not finished with them. Hours later, the cruise ship had settled into its after-midnight rhythm. Music from the lower decks had faded, footsteps had become occasional, and the corridors seemed longer beneath the dim emergency lights. Daniel found Elena near a secluded passage overlooking the dark water. You followed me, she said. I needed to talk. We talked. Not enough. Elena looked toward the empty corridor behind him. Daniel, please. Go back to the cabin. You were really going to leave me. I told you that. After the cruise. Yes. And you were going to walk away like none of this mattered. Elena shook her head. It mattered. That's why I stayed as long as I did. He stepped closer. She stepped back. Daniel, I keep thinking there has to be something I can say. There isn't. His face tightened. You never even gave me a chance. I gave you years. The words seemed to echo between them. Daniel looked toward the water, then back at her. Was it him? Elena hesitated. That's not the point. It is to me. No. The point is that I was already gone before I met him. Daniel's breathing changed. For a moment, he seemed unable to understand what she meant. Then anger returned. So I was living with someone who had already left me. I was living with someone I was afraid to disappoint. I loved you. You loved having me. He flinched. Elena saw something change in his eyes. She turned toward the corridor. Daniel caught her wrist. She froze. Let go. I just need you to listen. You're hurting me. He released her, but neither moved. The ship continued forward, indifferent to them. Elena rubbed her wrist. I'm going back. Daniel stood in her way. Please. Move. I can't lose you. You already did. Something inside him seemed to collapse. His voice became small. Don't say that. I have to. He reached for her again. She pushed him away. Daniel stumbled, then looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Fear replaced anger in her face. Daniel, stay away from me. He heard the words, but they seemed distant. The argument became a blur of voices, accusations, and desperate attempts to make the past change. Elena tried to get past him. Daniel stopped her. She pleaded. He shouted. Then, suddenly, there was silence. Elena was no longer moving. Daniel stared at her. For several seconds, his mind refused to understand what had happened. Ellie? Nothing. He knelt beside her. Get up. Nothing. The ship's engines hummed beneath the floor. Somewhere far away, laughter rose and disappeared. Daniel remained there, staring at the woman who had told him she was leaving. He touched her hand, then pulled his own hand away. No! The word barely escaped him. He stood. He walked several steps, stopped, and turned back. He waited for Elena to move. She did not. Minutes passed. Daniel's thoughts began changing. At first, there was only panic. Then came the instinct to survive. He looked toward the corridor. No witnesses. He looked at the railing. At the dark water beyond it. His mind began assembling possibilities. An accident. A fall. A moment of confusion in the darkness. He imagined what people would say if they found her there. He imagined himself grieving. He imagined questions. He told himself he was only frightened that anyone would think the same thing in his position. But another thought followed, colder and more deliberate. If Elena had slipped, if the darkness had taken her, then perhaps nobody would ever need to know what happened between them. He could already hear the story forming in his head, simple enough to survive questions, convincing enough to become truth. That was what he needed himself to believe. Then he realized the most terrifying part. He was no longer thinking about how to save Elena. He was thinking about how to make everyone believe he had not killed her. And as the ship carried them deeper into the night, Daniel took his first deliberate step toward hiding what had happened. The first deliberate step had been taken, but Daniel still had one thing left to do: become the husband everyone expected him to be. By dawn, he had returned to the cabin. He stood in the doorway for several seconds, staring at the empty bed. Then he forced himself to breathe, ran a hand through his hair, and picked up the phone. I can't find my wife. His voice sounded broken. The ship's security officer arrived with another crew member. Daniel met them in the corridor, pale and exhausted. When did you last see her? After midnight. We argued. She was upset. About what? Our marriage. Daniel looked down. She said she needed space. I thought she went somewhere to be alone. The officer studied him. And you didn't follow her? Daniel hesitated for half a second. No. It was the first lie. The officer asked where Elena might have gone. Daniel mentioned the promenade, the observation areas, and several quiet sections of the ship. I was worried, he added. I should have looked harder. The words were carefully chosen. They made him sound guilty of neglect rather than something worse. Security began searching. Within minutes, cameras were being reviewed. Daniel sat nearby, answering questions whenever asked. He cooperated. He offered Elena's description, her clothing, and details about the argument. He even handed over her photograph. But small contradictions began appearing. He said Elena had left the cabin shortly after midnight. Then he said their argument had continued longer. He claimed he had not known where she was going. Yet he described the secluded passage she had supposedly chosen with unsettling precision. The security officer noticed. Daniel noticed the officer noticing. Meanwhile, Adrian was beginning to panic. He had received no message from Elena. At first, he assumed she had changed her mind about meeting him. Then, he heard that security was searching for her. His stomach tightened. If investigators checked the messages, they would find him. If they found him, they would discover the affair. And if they discovered the affair, Elena's disappearance would suddenly have another story attached to it. Adrian walked toward the captain's office, then stopped. He could still say nothing. But silence would look suspicious too. Inside the security room, surveillance footage began revealing fragments of the previous night. A corridor. A shadow. Elena. Then Daniel. The investigators watched without speaking. The captain arrived and demanded an update. "She is still missing," the security officer said. "Last confirmed location?" The officer pointed toward the monitor. "There." The footage showed Elena walking into the secluded section. Seconds later, Daniel appeared. The captain's expression changed. "Did he tell you that?" "No." Another camera angle showed them speaking. Then the view disappeared behind a structural column. The investigators rewound it. Again. And again. Daniel sat outside, still wearing the face of a devastated husband. But now the ship had begun telling a different story. And somewhere beyond that door, Adrian knew the truth was moving toward him too. The captain turned from the screen. "Find out who knew about the argument." The security officer nodded. Daniel heard voices behind the office door. He could not hear the words, but he understood the danger. The performance he had prepared was already becoming harder to maintain. An investigator approached him. "Mr. Daniel, I need to clarify something." Daniel lifted his eyes. "Of course. You said your wife wanted to be alone." "Yes." "Did she say where she was going?" "But you mentioned the aft passage before we told you we were searching that area." Daniel paused. "I remembered seeing her go that direction. I'm tired. I'm not thinking clearly." The investigator said nothing. Across the ship, Adrian entered the captain's office. "I need to speak with you privately." "About Elena?" Adrian swallowed. "Yes." For a moment, he could not speak. Then he said the words he had been terrified to say. "Elena and I were involved." The captain stared at him. "When did you last see her?" Adrian looked toward the floor. "Last night." Now there were three versions of Elena's final hours. Daniel's, Adrian's, and the evidence beginning to emerge from the cameras. Only one of them could survive the investigation. The investigation changed the moment the cameras stopped agreeing with Daniel. Until then, he had been a grieving husband with a simple explanation. Elena had been upset. They had argued. She had wanted to be alone. But surveillance footage had a different memory. A detective named Mercer sat in the security room with the footage paused on the screen. Daniel was visible near the aft passage. "You said you never came here after the argument," Mercer said. Daniel stared at the monitor. "I must have been mistaken. You were very specific yesterday." "I was exhausted," Mercer continued. Another camera showed Daniel leaving the cabin earlier than he had reported. A digital access record placed him near the restricted corridor. A crew member remembered seeing him there. Piece by piece, his timeline began to collapse. Daniel insisted he was confused. Mercer did not argue. He simply wrote everything down. Meanwhile, another detective reconstructed Elena's final hours. She had spoken with Adrian. She had argued with Daniel. She had moved through several areas of the ship. Then she had entered the secluded passage. After that, there was no clear explanation. Only silence. Adrian was questioned separately. At first, he denied knowing Elena well. "She was a passenger," he said. Mercer watched him carefully. "Only a passenger?" "Yes." The answer came too quickly. Mercer placed Elena's phone records on the table. "You exchanged messages." Adrian said nothing. "You met privately." Still nothing. "And you knew she intended to leave her husband." Adrian finally looked up. "I didn't want this to become public. That isn't what I asked. I could lose my position, and Elena could be dead." The room became quiet. Adrian lowered his head. Finally, he admitted the relationship. He said it had begun before the cruise and had become serious enough that Elena intended to leave Daniel after they returned home. Did Daniel know? Not directly. But he suspected? Yes. Did Elena tell you she was afraid of him? Adrian hesitated. She said Daniel would never accept the separation. Mercer leaned forward. Those were her words. She said he would make leaving difficult. The detective wrote that down. Now the case had something it had not possessed before. A possible motive. Daniel had not simply lost his wife. He had been facing the certainty that she intended to leave him. And if that was true, then his argument with Elena was no longer just an argument. It was the final confrontation between a man desperate to preserve a marriage and a woman determined to escape it. Mercer returned to the surveillance footage. He watched Daniel follow Elena into the secluded section. Then he watched the empty corridor afterward. He rewound the recording. There was no visible violence. No witness. No obvious explanation. But Daniel had lied about being there. Adrian had lied about knowing Elena. And Elena was gone. Mercer closed the file. Bring Daniel back in, he said. The next interview would no longer begin with sympathy. It would begin with the question neither man wanted to answer. What happened after Elena realized she was in danger? Mercer began building a minute-by-minute timeline on the glass wall. At 11:42, Elena left the public lounge. At 11:49, Adrian received her last message. At 12:03, Daniel entered the aft corridor. At 12:17, Daniel returned alone. The times were still provisional, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. A bartender remembered Elena asking for water. A steward remembered Daniel looking unusually agitated. Another passenger recalled hearing raised voices from somewhere beyond the corridor. None of those details proved murder. Together, however, they narrowed the space in which the truth could hide. Daniel was asked why his phone had connected to a network access point near the aft section. He said he did not know. He was asked why he had told security that Elena left the cabin at midnight when the door log showed her leaving earlier. He said he had misremembered. Mercer listened. People forgot things. People lied. Sometimes the difference was impossible to see until enough facts surrounded the lie. Across the ship, Adrian realized that his confession had changed everything. He had hoped admitting the affair would protect him from suspicion by making him less suspicious. Instead, it implicated him further. The confession had changed everything, but not in the way Adrian had hoped. Mercer now had 3 people connected to Elena, and each had something to hide. The first discovery came from Elena's personal files. Investigators found a draft message she had never sent. It was addressed to a friend and explained that she intended to leave Daniel after the cruise. She had already considered where she would stay, what belongings she would take, and how she would explain the separation. This meant the decision had not been sudden. Elena had been preparing. But preparation did not mean certainty. Other messages revealed hesitation. She was frightened of Daniel's reaction. She worried about destroying the life they had built. She even wondered whether leaving would make everything worse. Mercer read the messages twice. Elena had not simply been an unfaithful wife planning an escape. She had been a woman trapped between fear, guilt, and the desire to begin again. Then investigators turned their attention to Adrian. His position made the affair more complicated than a private relationship. He had professional responsibilities toward passengers, and his involvement with Elena had crossed boundaries he was expected to maintain. He had used private conversations and opportunities created by his position to become emotionally close to her. Adrian insisted that he loved her. Mercer believed he probably did. That did not make his choices innocent. "You knew she was vulnerable," Mercer said. "I knew she was unhappy. And you became the person she depended on." Adrian looked away. "I never forced her." "No. But you encouraged her to leave." Adrian said nothing. The distinction mattered. Someone could exploit another person without threatening them. Someone could create dependence without issuing a command. Then came Daniel's secrets. A search of his digital records revealed that he had been monitoring Elena long before the cruise. He had checked her location history. He had accessed shared accounts without telling her. He had saved screenshots of conversations with friends and questioned her about people she had never mentioned. Most disturbing were records showing that he had repeatedly searched for ways to discover whether she was communicating with another man. Daniel had not simply become jealous when he discovered the affair. He had been building a private system of surveillance around his wife. Mercer sat alone after reviewing the evidence. The case was no longer clean. There was no single villain who had appeared from nowhere. There were choices. Years of them. Elena had hidden the truth because she wanted freedom but feared the consequences. Adrian had crossed professional boundaries because he wanted Elena and convinced himself that emotional intimacy made his actions acceptable. Daniel had turned love into monitoring, suspicion, and control, then convinced himself that fear of losing Elena justified his behavior. The detective returned to the central question. Why had Elena died? The easiest answer was jealousy. The obvious story was that Daniel discovered his wife's affair, lost control, and killed her. But Mercer was beginning to understand that this explanation was too small. Jealousy could explain the final explosion. It could not explain the years that came before it. Control could. Resentment could. Fear could. Obsession could. And together, those forces created something more dangerous than a single moment of rage. Mercer wrote 3 names on the board. Elena, Adrian, Daniel. Under each name, he wrote one word. Secrets. Then he stepped back. The investigation had started with a missing woman and a grieving husband. Now it was becoming a story about 3 people who had each lied for different reasons. The question was no longer simply who wanted Elena gone. It was who had helped create the circumstances in which her death became possible. Those records contained something Mercer had not expected. Searches had been made during the week before the cruise. Daniel had searched Elena's messages, travel plans, and conversations. One search stood out because it had been made hours before departure. It concerned how long deleted messages could remain recoverable. Mercer stared at the entry. That was not evidence of murder. It was evidence that Daniel had been preparing for something else entirely. And the answer, Mercer suspected, would begin with Daniel's surveillance records. The surveillance records had given Mercer the opening he needed. Daniel sat across from him in the interview room, hands folded, expression exhausted. "You told us you never went to the aft corridor." "I was confused." "You told us Elena left because she needed space." "She did." "You told us you did not know about Adrian." Daniel looked up. "I knew they were friends." Mercer placed the printed records on the table. "You knew they were more than friends." Daniel said nothing. Mercer slid another page forward. Elena planned to leave you. Daniel's jaw tightened. She was confused. She had already made arrangements. She would have changed her mind. How do you know? Because she loved me. Mercer watched him carefully. Did she tell you that? Daniel looked down. No. The silence stretched. Mercer simply kept placing facts between them. Daniel's phone records. The corridor footage. The deleted messages. The searches he had made before the cruise. The witness who heard Elena pleading. Piece by piece, the story Daniel had constructed became impossible to maintain. Finally, Daniel whispered, She was going to leave. Yes. She actually meant it. Yes. His breathing became uneven. I thought she was just trying to hurt me. Mercer waited. She kept saying she was unhappy. I thought if I gave her time, she would come back. And when she told you she wouldn't. Daniel closed his eyes. I couldn't accept it. The first admission was barely audible. He had confronted Elena after discovering the affair. He had demanded answers and accused her of humiliating him. He had begged her to stay, then blamed her for destroying their marriage. Mercer asked what happened next. Daniel stared at the table. She tried to leave. And you stopped her? Yes. Why? Daniel swallowed. Because I was angry. Mercer remained silent. Daniel continued. But it wasn't only that night. His voice had changed. It was flatter now. I had been angry for a long time. He described months of suspicion, checking Elena's phone, questioning where she went, and imagining the people she might be seeing. Every unanswered message became proof. Every late return became betrayal. Every attempt by Elena to establish a boundary became another rejection. I kept thinking she was choosing other people over me. You were controlling her. I was trying to keep my marriage together. You were controlling her. Daniel looked at him. Maybe. Mercer let the silence settle. Then he asked the question Daniel had been avoiding. Did you intend to kill her? Daniel stared at the wall. No. Then tell me what happened. Daniel's eyes filled, but his voice remained strangely calm. She said she was leaving. I told her she couldn't. She said I couldn't decide that. He paused. I remember thinking that everything was ending. And then? I lost control. Mercer waited for rage, tears, excuses. Instead, Daniel described the aftermath with disturbing precision. He remembered the silence, the empty corridor, and the sound of the ship moving beneath him. He remembered looking at Elena and realizing she would never answer him again. I stood there, he said. What were you thinking? Daniel looked directly at Mercer. I thought about what people would say. Not Elena. Not whether she could be saved. People. You were thinking about yourself. Daniel lowered his eyes. I was terrified. Of being caught? Of being alone. He rubbed his hands together. Then came the sentence Mercer knew would define the confession. I thought if she couldn't leave me, none of this would have to end. Mercer said nothing. The murder had grown through years of possessiveness, resentment, humiliation, fear, and the belief that love gave him the right to keep another person from leaving. And when Elena refused to stay, Daniel had chosen control over acceptance. Mercer closed the folder and looked at him for several seconds. Your confession is being recorded, Daniel. Daniel nodded. But Mercer knew the confession had created another question that could not wait. If Daniel had planned to hide the death, what exactly had he done after leaving the corridor? That answer would determine whether the killing could be prosecuted as something more deliberate than Daniel was claiming. The answer to what Daniel had done after the killing finally brought the investigation to its end. By the time the cruise ship reached port, its bright decks had become something else in the memories of those aboard. Passengers stepped onto the dock carrying photographs, souvenirs, unfinished conversations, and stories about the trip. Most knew only that a woman had died. For the crew, there was no forgetting. The secluded corridor was photographed, examined, and eventually cleaned. The cabin was sealed. Security footage was copied and placed into evidence. The ordinary machinery of the ship continued around those rooms, but nothing about them felt ordinary anymore. Daniel was taken into custody. His confession, the surveillance footage, digital records, witness statements, and forensic evidence formed a case that no explanation could undo. He had spent years believing that losing Elena would destroy him. In the end, his refusal to accept her freedom destroyed the life he claimed to be protecting. At trial, the language became colder. Murder. Evidence. Motive. Sentence. The emotional chaos of the marriage was reduced to facts that could be presented before a judge. Daniel listened as prosecutors described the monitoring, the confrontation, the violence, and the attempt to make Elena's death appear accidental. When the sentence was finally delivered, Daniel showed little reaction. Justice had arrived, but it could not restore what had been taken. Adrian's consequences came differently. He was never charged with Elena's murder. He had not killed her. But his relationship with a passenger became impossible to separate from the scandal surrounding her death. His position was reviewed. His professional future collapsed. People who had once respected him stopped answering his calls. He tried to explain that he had loved Elena. That explanation changed nothing. He had crossed boundaries, encouraged a relationship with someone in a vulnerable marriage, and then remained silent because he feared what the truth would cost him. He carried that knowledge long after the ship had disappeared behind the horizon. But Elena's story could not be reduced to the choices of the two men around her. She had lied. She had betrayed Daniel. She had hidden her plans. She had fallen in love with someone she should never have pursued. She had also been frightened, unhappy, conflicted, and determined to reclaim a life she believed she had lost. None of those truths canceled the others. Her mistakes did not make her responsible for her own death. Her secrets did not give Daniel ownership over her. And her decision to leave did not require anyone's permission. Mercer thought about that distinction often. Cases like Elena's were rarely as simple as the first headline suggested. A jealous husband killed his unfaithful wife. It was easy to understand, easy to repeat, and easy to forget. But the truth was harder. Love could become fear. Fear could become control. Control could become resentment. And resentment, when fed long enough, could convince someone that another person's freedom was an injury. That was the danger. Daniel had not killed Elena because he loved her too much. He killed her because he could not accept that love did not give him the right to possess her. Weeks later, the ship sailed again. New passengers boarded. Children ran across the decks. Couples photographed the sunset. Music played in the lounges. Waiters carried drinks between tables. The ocean looked exactly as it had before. Most passengers knew nothing about Elena. They did not know her name. They did not know where she had stood beneath the midnight lights, or that a few decks away, investigators had once tried to reconstruct her final hours. The ship continued across the water, carrying thousands of people toward destinations they believed were still ahead of them. Mercer watched the horizon from shore. The case was closed. The evidence had been preserved. The guilty man had been sentenced. But closure was not the same as erasure. For those who survived the voyage, the ocean would remain beautiful, but never innocent again. Somewhere beneath that beauty was a memory that refused to disappear, no matter how far the ship traveled, ever completely. The sea could erase footprints almost immediately. Human beings were not so lucky.